He opened the door. Just a simple motion, a breath, a quiet creak in the dark hallway. But what he found on the other side was impossible. A woman, pale, unmoving, or so it seemed. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto his with a force that seemed to pace the very air. She should have been dead. The room smelled faintly of decay, yet her skin was untouched, her hair drifting like smoke in the dim light. Something about her presence was wrong. The world had rules, boundaries, and this moment violated every single one. History is full of those who should have disappeared, erased from memory, consumed by the machinery of power, or extinguished by forces that demand obedience. And yet, they return. Not always physically, sometimes psychologically, leaving traces, echoes, warnings. This woman was one of those echoes made flesh. Her gaze was not merely alive, it was accusatory. It held centuries of secrets, forgotten rituals, suppressed knowledge. And now, it rested on him. Power has always feared the witnesses. Those who see too much, who remember too clearly, are dangerous. They become anomalies, threats to the structure of control. Empires rise and fall on the careful orchestration of forgetting. Institutions, governments, even families participate in this quiet erasure, ensuring that only the stories they want survive. But occasionally, a witness escapes the system, a spark survives the fire, and the machinery trembles. The man did not move. Fear is not always sudden. Sometimes it creeps in, like shadowed water through the cracks in a floor. He felt it in his bones, a weight pressing against his chest, urging him to look away, to pretend he had not seen her. But the mind remembers. It catalogues anomalies. It cannot unsee what challenges its assumptions, especially when the anomaly is alive, breathing, staring. This is where the real danger begins, not in the physical act of encountering the impossible, but in the knowledge that follows. Once you see what should not exist, the world changes. Rules dissolve. Trust erodes. Fear becomes a lens through which every choice, every shadow, every whisper is measured. And in that moment, the door was no longer just an entryway. It was a threshold. He had stepped into forbidden history, and history does not forgive those who witness what should remain buried. The woman did not speak. Her lips parted slightly, as if to release a secret that had been trapped for decades, or centuries, but no sound came. And yet, her silence spoke louder than any scream. It carried the weight of hidden histories, suppressed knowledge, and forbidden truths that the world had spent lifetimes trying to bury. The air around her seemed to vibrate with unspoken warnings, each pulse a message meant only for those who could perceive beyond ordinary fear. Some doors are locked for a reason, not to protect what lies behind, but to protect the ignorant from seeing too much. Those who open them invite consequences they cannot imagine. The man had crossed that threshold. Every instinct screamed to retreat, but he remained, drawn by the impossible reality before him. The woman's gaze burned into him, and he understood. This was not just an encounter. It was initiation. Throughout history, knowledge has always been dangerous. Secret societies, shadow governments, hidden rituals, they exist precisely because ordinary minds cannot comprehend the true structure of power. They manipulate, erase, and silence witnesses, carefully crafting illusions of safety and normalcy. Those who stumble across these layers rarely survive unscathed. And yet, some persist, like echoes that refuse to die, like truths that refuse to be silenced. He could feel the layers pressing against him, the societal rules that said she should be dead, the psychological programming that insisted the world is safe, the internalized fear telling him to turn away. But awareness is contagious. Recognition of forbidden reality has its own gravity. The moment you see what should not exist, you are changed. You cannot return to ignorance. And in that instant, the woman, alive, impossible, unblinking, became a mirror reflecting not just her survival, but the systems that had tried to erase her, the rituals of control, the networks of power, the suppressed truths, the psychological manipulations, all encoded in her presence. And now, they were encoded in his perception. Every decision he had ever thought was free suddenly felt constrained by invisible levers, guiding him, watching him, testing him. The door closed behind him with a whisper, but the threshold had already been crossed. He was no longer outside the machinery of hidden history. He was inside it. And inside, nothing remains the same. The moment his eyes adjusted, he began to notice the details, The subtle marks in the room, the objects that did not belong, the faint residue of rituals long erased from memory. This was no ordinary encounter. Every symbol, every shadow, every artifact whispered a story of corruption that had been deliberately hidden. He realized that her existence was not accidental. She was a remnant of histories too dangerous for the world to remember, a living record of agendas designed to remain buried. The woman's survival challenged centuries of power. Institutions that claimed morality and order had deliberately hunted her kind. Secrets had been enforced with fire, steel, and silence. Entire populations had been conditioned to forget, to deny, to rationalize away anomalies. And yet, here she was, alive, unwavering, carrying the weight of forbidden truths that authorities thought they had destroyed. It was always about control. The machinery of influence, fear, and obedience stretches back further than most dare to imagine. Empires rose not by conquest alone, but by manipulating belief, erasing inconvenient knowledge, and scripting reality for generations. She had survived because she understood this truth instinctively. To remain alive is not to be lucky. It is to navigate systems designed to annihilate awareness. Her eyes held the patterns of power. Who benefits from silence? Who thrives on obedience? Who manipulates history to ensure the masses remain blind? Every observer of her story who fails to understand this becomes complicit. Every ritualized act of conformity, every unquestioned decree, every suppression of curiosity strengthens the invisible chains that have bound humanity for centuries. And now he was forced to see it. The illusions of safety, morality, and inevitability peeled away. Her presence demanded recognition of the hidden levers, financial, political, psychological, that shape reality while remaining invisible. The woman was not merely alive. She was a sentinel, a living archive, a challenge to the narrative that the powerful had painstakingly constructed. He understood, in that chilling instant, that encountering her was more than witnessing a miracle. It was a confrontation with the machinery of corruption itself, a glimpse into the systems that manipulate perception, identity, and obedience, and a test of whether he could endure the truth without surrendering to the terror it demanded. Her survival was not accidental. It was the product of knowledge buried deeper than the foundations of empires. The kind of knowledge that threatens institutions, destabilizes rituals, and shatters the illusions of morality. Centuries ago, men and women like her had been systematically erased, burned, exiled, silenced, because they remembered what the rulers feared most, the truth about how power operates, who it serves, and who it destroys. Corruption is ancient. It is not merely political, it is structural. Those who control the flow of information, who shape fear, and who dictate loyalty, do so with precision honed over generations. The woman embodied the consequences of defiance. She had survived the purges, witnessed conspiracies, and carried knowledge that authorities spent lifetimes trying to suppress. Her eyes, unblinking and calm, contained the weight of secrets that could unravel entire narratives. The truth is uncomfortable. Societies are built on omission, ritual, and manipulation. History is written by those who consolidate power, and every inconvenient detail is removed or twisted. Her presence revealed the lies laid upon lies, the hidden agendas operating behind the scenes, and the invisible hands guiding obedience. To see her is to confront these realities, to recognize the structures that survive by controlling perception, and to understand that most people are bound by chains they cannot even perceive. The machinery that attempted to erase her was precise and relentless. She had been hunted not for crime, not for defiance in the public sense, but for awareness itself. The ability to see patterns, to recall suppressed histories, to recognize manipulation. These were crimes against the established order. And yet, here she stood, untouched by fire, unaffected by ritualized attempts at erasure, a testament to the limits of control. Every object in the room seemed coded, a subtle reflection of the corruption that had protected her, or perhaps guided her survival. The patterns were deliberate, symbols of forgotten orders, remnants of ancient conspiracies, markers of knowledge forbidden to the masses. Her existence was a living paradox, a reminder of what had been destroyed and proof that truth cannot be completely annihilated. The man realized, with growing dread, that her survival was not just a story, it was a challenge. To see her was to inherit the responsibility of awareness. The corruption that allowed her to exist and yet be hunted demanded acknowledgement. And the deeper he looked, the more he understood. Some truths are too dangerous to be ignored, and some knowledge is too perilous to remain unexamined. The machinery that sought to erase her operated on the mind long before it touched the body. Centuries of control were encoded not in laws or armies, but in ritual, habit, and fear. The girl, the woman before him, had survived because she understood the architecture of obedience. To erase a mind, institutions need more than fire. They need indoctrination, repetition, and manipulation so subtle it becomes invisible to the very person it binds. Psychological control is ancient, precise, and devastatingly effective. People are trained from birth to accept boundaries, obey authority, and suppress curiosity. Storytelling, tradition, education, all carefully calibrated to enforce compliance. Those who deviate are not only punished but stigmatized. The machinery ensures that defiance becomes isolation, doubt becomes terror, and awareness becomes a liability. Entire societies are engineered to produce obedience without force. Her survival was a rebellion against these systems. She had learned to recognize the levers that guided perception, the triggers that manipulated emotion, and the rituals that enforced loyalty. Every unblinking gaze she held was a challenge. She refused to internalize fear. She refused to let ritual dictate truth. And that refusal made her dangerous, not because of action, but because of awareness itself. Modern parallels are everywhere. Fear, reward, ritualized repetition, social validation. These are contemporary mechanisms that bind minds invisibly. Most never notice the levers controlling them because the architecture is designed to be invisible. Obedience is voluntary. Submission is earned through conditioning. And yet, one conscious mind, one unblinking observer, can disrupt the system entirely. The man could feel it pressing in on him. The realization that her existence was a map of the mechanisms he had internalized unknowingly. Every habit, every instinct shaped by centuries of conditioning suddenly appeared as invisible chains. He understood, viscerally, that awareness alone is dangerous. It disrupts compliance, fractures perception, and destabilizes the carefully engineered reality that authority depends on. And so he looked at her again, and the magnitude of what she carried became clear. She was not just alive. She was a witness to systems that had sought to erase her. And that witness did more than survive. It illuminated the hidden levers of control, exposing the architecture of power, obedience, and fear that most lives are quietly enslaved to. She was a repository of secrets the world was never meant to see. The agendas that sought her death were ancient, deliberate, and ruthless. Every whisper of her name had been erased, every record of her existence obliterated, every witness silenced. And yet, she persisted. Her survival was a direct threat to the hidden structures of power, the invisible agreements that maintain control over entire societies. Hidden agendas are rarely visible. They operate beneath the surface, embedded in institutions, laws, and rituals that appear benign or necessary. But beneath that facade lies orchestration, the manipulation of fear, the enforcement of obedience, the selective erasure of inconvenient truths. The woman had lived within the shadows of these agendas, navigating corridors where knowledge could kill or liberate, and emerging unscathed because she understood the rules of the game. Her eyes told stories of betrayals long forgotten, of pacts made in secrecy, of corruption so deep it defied comprehension. Generations of power had moved to suppress truths she carried effortlessly in memory and presence. Her gaze revealed the inconsistencies, the hidden motives, and the deliberate distortions crafted to enforce obedience and blind the masses. The world had been programmed to forget. She remembered. Psychological control, ancient corruption, and social engineering converged in her existence. She was the anomaly no system could account for, the unmeasured variable that threatened predictive models of obedience. The very institutions designed to eradicate anomalies had, through oversight or fate, failed. And in failing, they revealed themselves. The patterns of suppression, manipulation, and calculated erasure became visible through her presence alone. Every encounter with her was a confrontation with the invisible forces that shape reality. She demonstrated that power operates silently, structurally, and systemically. Knowledge is weaponized. Memory is dangerous. Awareness is forbidden. And those who remember too much, see too clearly, or understand too deeply are either neutralized or hidden from history entirely. The man felt it, the weight of forbidden truth pressing into his mind. The woman's survival was no longer merely astonishing. It was a revelation. To witness her was to glimpse the hidden agendas threading through centuries, the suppressed truths that defined obedience and control, and the raw, uncompromising power of memory preserved against the machinery of erasure. The machinery of control is precise, relentless, and adaptive. Entire empires, institutions, and rituals were designed to eliminate anomalies like her. And yet, here she was, alive, unblinking, impossible. Her survival revealed the first fractures in a system that had believed itself infallible. No matter how complete the suppression, no matter how meticulously the history had been rewritten, awareness cannot be entirely extinguished. Power relies on predictability. Ritual, repetition, and fear enforce patterns of compliance. To survive outside those patterns is to threaten the system. Her presence was a rupture, a disruption in a chain that had extended unbroken for centuries. Every unblinking glance, every deliberate silence, undermined the invisible rules that bound society. She exposed the fragility hidden beneath centuries of control. The cracks were subtle but undeniable. Mistakes, oversights, and lapses in enforcement, all these allowed her to persist. Systems are not omnipotent. They are maintained by human perception, by fear, and by internalized obedience. Awareness of forbidden truths acts like water seeping through a dam. Slowly, inevitably, it erodes the foundation. And the more one observes, the more one understands, the larger the fractures become. Her gaze illuminated patterns others accepted without question. The man began to see them, the rituals disguised as normality, the social pressures that conditioned obedience, the narratives crafted to suppress dissent. Every subtle reinforcement, every invisible leash, suddenly became apparent. Awareness destabilizes control because it makes invisible forces visible. It dissolves certainty, exposes manipulation, and forces reckoning. And yet, systems adapt. The machinery of power is not easily defeated. It evolves. But the first step toward disruption is awareness. Observation itself becomes a form of resistance, because control depends on compliance, and compliance depends on ignorance. The woman's very survival was proof. Knowledge cannot be fully erased. Insight cannot be burned, exiled, or silenced. The man understood it now. Seeing was not merely understanding. It was an act of rebellion. Each recognition of hidden agendas, each awareness of subtle control, chipped away at the authority that had sought to erase her. And in that realization, he felt a dangerous exhilaration. Awareness was power, and power, once recognized, cannot be fully contained. To witness what should not exist is to step into a shadowed world where reality no longer feels safe. The man felt it immediately, the disorientation, the creeping doubt, the subtle collapse of certainty. Forbidden truths are not neutral, they are corrosive. They erode assumptions, fracture perception, and ignite fear that is both instinctive and existential. Awareness of what others cannot see changes the very architecture of thought. The human mind resists knowledge that threatens its frameworks. Cognitive dissonance emerges, accompanied by anxiety, confusion, and at times, denial. Those who confront forbidden truths often feel isolated, haunted, and burdened. Society has conditioned obedience and reward, and the individual who steps outside these systems is forced to navigate reality without the support of collective perception. The woman before him embodied this tension. She had endured centuries of erasure and manipulation, yet she remained lucid, alive, and unblinking. This is why systems of control are so effective. Fear of isolation, ridicule, or loss of status ensures that even those who perceive anomalies hesitate, suppress insight, or rationalize away contradictions. The machinery does not need to threaten everyone. It only needs to manipulate perception, and the mind becomes its own jailer. Observation itself becomes dangerous, because it triggers awareness that cannot be unseen, yet exacts a psychological toll. The man recognized the pattern, the creeping paranoia, the hyper-awareness of subtle manipulations, the compulsion to question everything around him. Forbidden knowledge imposes a burden of vigilance. Ordinary life becomes alien, and ordinary truths feel shallow or suspect. To live in awareness is to carry a weight few are willing to bear, but it is the only path to autonomy. The woman's unblinking eyes were a mirror of this experience. In them, he saw centuries of witnessing, survival, and understanding. Her gaze reflected the psychological reality of confronting truths that others have buried. It was a reminder that once you perceive the structures of corruption, manipulation, and control, your mind is forever altered, and your existence becomes a negotiation with forces that thrive on ignorance. This is the crucible of forbidden awareness. The moment you see beyond the veil, you are changed. Isolation, fear, and doubt are inevitable. But so is empowerment. The psychological weight is the price of clarity, and the clarity is the beginning of power. Obedience is not accidental. It is engineered, cultivated over lifetimes, and reinforced through rituals both overt and subtle. From birth, humans are trained to respond to authority, to internalize fear, and to conform to patterns they rarely question. The woman before him had survived precisely because she understood these mechanisms, avoided them, and learned to navigate the labyrinth of control without surrendering her perception. Ritual is a silent enforcer. The repetition of symbols, words, and behaviors programs the mind to accept authority without scrutiny. Collective ceremonies, social hierarchies, and coded language condition loyalty while masking control as tradition. Across generations, compliance becomes instinctive. Children inherit obedience not through coercion alone, but through normalization, an invisible architecture that rewards conformity and punishes curiosity. Institutions exploit this instinct expertly. Religion, education, governance, and even social customs become levers of influence, calibrating fear, reward, and shame to guide behavior. Compliance is rarely demanded outright. It is earned subtly, cultivated through repetition, and reinforced until the individual enforces their own subjugation. Awareness is the anomaly the system cannot easily predict or suppress. The woman's presence disrupted these patterns. She bore the memory of rituals long erased, knowledge of levers unseen, and the awareness that authority itself can be questioned, circumvented, or resisted. Her survival was a testament to the fragility of control. No matter how precise the mechanisms, consciousness cannot be entirely contained. Insight, once achieved, becomes a ripple capable of destabilizing entire systems. Across generations, these rituals have been refined. Fear is applied selectively. Rewards are strategically distributed. Narratives are carefully constructed. Every element reinforces submission without the subject realizing the chains are there. The machinery thrives on invisibility and internalization. Most obey not because of coercion, but because their minds have been trained to desire compliance. Yet the woman embodies what the system fears most: cognition that escapes programming. Observation becomes resistance. Memory becomes rebellion. Awareness becomes a weapon. Her unblinking eyes are the proof that even the most sophisticated rituals cannot fully dominate the human spirit. To see her is to glimpse the invisible levers, and to understand them is to inherit a responsibility that few are willing, or prepared, to bear. Her survival was not simply a matter of chance. It defied the orchestration of networks that had moved unseen for centuries. Powerful families, shadowed councils, and secret societies had long collaborated to suppress anomalies like her. These networks did not act openly. Their influence is woven into the fabric of politics, religion, education, and culture. Every law, every custom, every hidden ledger carried their fingerprints. And yet, despite the sophistication of their design, she endured. The machinery of conspiracy relies on invisibility. Control is most effective when it appears natural, inevitable, or moral. Generations are conditioned to follow patterns, trust authority, and accept the narratives constructed for them. Individuals who remember, question, or resist are anomalies, threats that must be neutralized. And the network had tried, repeatedly, to erase her existence, relying on the precision of fear, ritual, and social enforcement. What is striking and terrifying is the patience and foresight these networks wield. They operate on decades, even centuries, measuring compliance, anticipating resistance, and correcting error silently. They understand that overpower is fragile. Subtlety ensures obedience. Memory is dangerous. History is rewritten not by accident, but by design. Every story lost, every witness eliminated, strengthens the invisible chains that hold society in alignment with their agenda. She carried the knowledge they tried to bury. Every suppressed truth, every inconvenient fact, every hidden ritual of manipulation and control lived in her memory and presence. Her gaze, unblinking and unwavering, exposed the gaps in the system, the places where human error, fate, or determination had allowed her to slip through. To see her was to glimpse the architecture of conspiracy itself, and the lengths to which it will go to maintain dominance. The man felt the weight of this revelation pressing in. The networks were not myths, they were real, methodical, and ruthless. The woman's existence was a challenge, a rupture in centuries of carefully orchestrated suppression. And with that realization came understanding. Knowledge, observation, and awareness are not neutral, they are weapons against control. Her survival proves that even the most entrenched systems can be destabilized by insight, and that the machinery of conspiracy depends entirely on the compliance of minds that remain unaware. Control is not only external, it lives inside the mind. The networks that sought her erasure understood this intimately. Fear alone is crude. Violence alone is blunt. The true machinery of dominance operates in the spaces between thought and perception, shaping reality without leaving visible chains. Obedience is cultivated, not demanded, and the mind becomes its own jailer. Psychological warfare is subtle, pervasive, and relentless. It begins with isolation, creating a sense that the individual is alone in their perceptions, that their doubts, questions, or anomalies are dangerous or irrational. Then comes gaslighting, rewriting reality so the witness doubts their own senses, memories, and instincts. Every social interaction becomes a test, a reinforcement, or a trap. Over time, the mind begins to comply willingly, internalizing the narratives imposed by unseen hands. Her survival demonstrates the failure of this system. She had endured the most sophisticated forms of manipulation, erasure, rumor, threat, and ritualized fear, and emerged unbroken. Her eyes, steady and unblinking, reflect the strength of a mind that recognizes these levers, anticipates their use, and refuses the compliance they demand. Awareness becomes resistance, and resistance is the most dangerous force to a network built on obedience. These mechanisms are timeless. Ancient empires used public shaming, religious indoctrination, and ritualized punishment to control the populace. Modern networks employ surveillance, social conditioning, algorithms, and selective information to achieve the same ends. The tools evolve, but the principle remains. The human mind is the battlefield, and perception is the prize. To confront this is disorienting. Every assumption about safety, morality, and inevitability dissolves. Those who survive such encounters are mocked. They see the patterns invisible to others, feel the weight of manipulation, and navigate a reality designed to contain them. The man realized this now. Encountering her is not simply witnessing a miracle. It is entering the theater of psychological control itself. The networks feared witnesses like her not because she could overthrow armies, but because she could remember, see, and teach others. Knowledge becomes contagion. Awareness undermines compliance. And the mind that resists internalized control is a weapon the powerful cannot predict, nor easily destroy. Power is never maintained by mere authority. It is preserved through ritual, not the kind performed on public stages or in grand halls, but the quiet, calculated ceremonies enacted behind locked doors and sealed archives. These rituals do not rely on superstition. They are operational, psychological, strategic, designed to bind loyalty, erase dissent, and reinforce the hierarchy that keeps the networks in control. The man felt this truth as the woman's presence revealed it. Her very existence was an interruption in a ritual world. For centuries, the networks had perfected the art of orchestrated secrecy. Cycles of initiation that reward obedience, symbols that divide the aware from the unaware, and oaths that turn men into instruments. Each ritual was a strand in an invisible web, woven tightly enough to hold entire societies in place. The most effective rituals were not physical, but emotional. Fear delivered in controlled doses. Shame applied with precision. Rewards dispensed so carefully that men believed they had earned them. These techniques ensured that the hierarchy did not simply command power, it was worshipped. Those below it carried out its will without ever seeing the hands that shaped their actions. Even history became ritual. Records were rewritten. Stories were cleansed. Events were reinterpreted to serve a narrative that justified the hierarchy's existence. Those who questioned the official story became outcasts. Those who accepted it gained the illusion of belonging. The ritual was self-sustaining, self-reinforcing, and self-erasing. It existed not because people believed in it, but because they feared the cost of refusing it. The woman was a fracture in this system. She had survived not by confronting the rituals head-on, but by slipping between them, seeing their patterns, predicting their cycles, and refusing the emotional hooks that bound others. Her memory was a threat precisely because it broke the continuity of the ritual. She remembered what had been erased. She lived what had been denied. And in her eyes, the man saw the truth. Rituals only hold power when the mind consents to play its part. The networks understood this. It is why they target perception, why they police narrative, why they silence anomalies. A single witness can unravel centuries of design by refusing the illusion. Knowledge, in this world, is not simply power. It is a breach, and every breach widens the cracks in the architecture of control. Power leaves fingerprints, even when its architects don't. If you follow those prints far enough, beyond the stories you were taught, beyond the myths polished into comfort, you arrive at something older than kingdoms and colder than faith. The networks that sought to erase her were not born in a council room or carved out of political ambition. They emerged from a lineage that predates recorded history, a lineage built on the simple truth that men can be shaped more easily than stone. Their origins trace back to the first cities, those strange, sudden civilizations that rose with impossible speed and left behind architecture no one can fully explain. Before governments, before temples, before written law, there were groups who understood how fear could organize masses, how symbols could command loyalty, and how stories could control perception. They discovered that the human mind bends long before the body does. And once they learned that, the world became clay. Over time, these groups split, evolved, merged, and adapted. Their names changed with every empire. Their symbols shifted with every dynasty. But their purpose remained constant: to direct the flow of human belief, to steer narratives, to adjust memory, to sculpt the world through perception rather than force. Real history, the one buried beneath monuments and rewritten chronicles, is a record of their victories. Civilizations that flourished did so because they aligned with the hierarchy. Civilizations that vanished often did so because they defied it. The woman was a casualty of this hidden timeline, not because she opposed them, but because she remembered things that contradicted the story they needed the world to believe. Her existence was an error in the narrative, a breach in the architecture they spent millennia constructing. Ancient societies had tried to silence her. Later regimes refined the methods. Modern institutions perfected them. And yet, through every era, through every attempt, she persisted. Her survival was not just improbable, it was impossible by their standards. The man felt a quiet horror settle in as he realized this. These networks were not temporary conspiracies. They were the custodians of a worldview. They shaped kings as easily as they shaped commoners. They engineered revolutions when needed, suppressed inventions when convenient, and sculpted moral codes when useful. They had no nation, no era, no single identity. They were continuity itself. To encounter her was to see the first crack in that continuity, a living contradiction, a witness to everything they tried to bury. And once a man sees that crack, he can never truly return to the world he lived in before. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, deliberate, measured, not the tremor of someone fearful, but the calm of someone who has witnessed centuries of erasure and survived. Each word seemed to carry weight beyond the room, as if it resonated through invisible corridors of history. She spoke a truth that no one alive had dared to voice, a reality that the networks had worked tirelessly to bury. The world you see, she began, is an illusion built on consent and silence. Obedience is not voluntary, it is orchestrated. History is not recorded, it is curated. Faith, ritual, reward, these are tools, invisible levers that guide men like marionettes. And those who perceive this, who remember beyond the lies, are hunted, hidden, and erased. The man's pulse quickened. Every instinct screamed danger, yet every fiber of his mind recognized the magnitude of what she said. She was not recounting a conspiracy theory. She was detailing an architecture of power that shaped civilizations, institutions, and personal lives alike. Her survival proved its inevitability, but her words revealed its method. The machinery was everywhere, psychological, structural, and systemic, and it thrived on the blind obedience of billions. Her voice carried further, exposing patterns that had remained invisible for generations. The way rituals reinforce submission, the subtle calibration of fear and reward, the stories rewritten to erase dissent. The most dangerous thing, she said, is perception itself. To see the mechanism is to disrupt it. Awareness is a weapon. Memory is a threat. And those who survive while knowing are the anomaly the world fears. For a moment, the man felt the weight of centuries press against him. He understood instinctively that knowledge came at a cost. Once you perceive the hidden levers, the rituals, the manipulations, the networks, they will test you, isolate you, and attempt to reclaim you into compliance. Few minds survive the revelation intact. But she had survived, and her presence was a template for resistance. This first truth, the truth the networks fought to erase, was clear. Obedience is manufactured. History is curated. Perception is controlled. And only those willing to see clearly, even at the risk of isolation and terror, can begin to navigate the world as it truly is. Her eyes, unblinking, were a mirror and a warning. The first truth changes everything. The moment he understood, nothing was the same. Reality fractured, every familiar shape and sound vibrating with new significance. The truths she revealed were not abstract, they were operational. They dictated behavior, perception, and belief for generations, and he could feel their invisible grip loosening on him even as it pressed harder. To see is to awaken. To awaken is to become dangerous. The world had been orchestrated around him without his consent. Institutions, rituals, and even the flow of information had been engineered to keep minds compliant. Every moral framework, every narrative he had accepted without question, now revealed itself as an instrument of control. This realization is both liberating and terrifying. Liberation in clarity, terror in knowing how deep the design runs. Knowledge carries consequences. He felt the subtle anxiety of awareness, the isolation that accompanies insight, the paranoia that is not irrational but rational, the compulsion to question everything. Each interaction, each story, each unexamined assumption became suspect. This is the crucible of perception. Once illuminated, nothing can remain unquestioned. Her survival was the proof that insight is the ultimate threat to control. If one mind can perceive the invisible levers, it becomes impossible to maintain total compliance. And one mind awakens others. Knowledge is contagious. Perception spreads, and obedience weakens. The networks that had shaped history for centuries tremble not under armies, but under awareness. He realized the cost of perception, vigilance, skepticism, and isolation. But he also recognized the power. Seeing the hidden structures allowed him to navigate them rather than be trapped by them. He could anticipate manipulation, recognize ritual, and understand the motives behind actions that others took for granted. Awareness transformed fear into strategy, confusion into clarity, and oppression into opportunity. This is the first true consequence of forbidden knowledge. The world shifts under your gaze. You cannot unsee what is designed to be invisible. You cannot unknow what is taught to be forgotten. And every step forward becomes a conscious choice, whether to comply with the machinery of control or to operate outside it, aware, vigilant, and unflinching. The door he had opened led not only to a woman who should have been dead but to a reality most minds cannot endure. To see her is to inherit her vigilance, to feel the weight of hidden agendas, and to confront the machinery that has shaped every aspect of life without mercy. There are moments in a man's life when he feels something shifting deep inside him, something old, something instinctive, something that has slept beneath layers of conditioning. The woman's words struck that place in him, awakening a memory he didn't know he carried. Not a memory of events, but a memory of identity, as if some part of him recognized the truth long before his mind could name it. She spoke of symbols, not as decoration, but as anchors. Throughout every age, every empire, every shadowed institution, symbols were the most guarded tools. They shape perception. They align thought. They bind or liberate identity. And the networks he now sensed in the deepest folds of history had understood this perfectly. They used symbols to guide the obedient, and they erased symbols that awakened the free. The woman leaned closer, not with threat, but with inevitability. The mind, she said, requires a sigil to define itself. Without one, it belongs to whomever shapes its fears. It was then he understood why certain images repeat across cultures, why ancient civilizations separated by oceans carved the same marks, why stories from forgotten eras contained the same patterns of resistance, the same warnings, the same quiet defiance against an unseen hierarchy. These symbols were not random. They were remnants of an older conflict, a silent war for human perception. Symbols are passwords for the soul, keys for consciousness, anchors for identity. And in that moment, he sensed the truth. If the mind does not choose its symbol, the world chooses one for it. Her eyes, still unblinking, held the weight of 1,000 lost civilizations. The networks fear men who choose their own symbol, she whispered. Because a man who chooses is a man who cannot be programmed. He felt something stir, a pull toward clarity, toward self-definition, toward a kind of inner sovereignty long denied but never fully extinguished. There was a reason she had appeared to him, a reason he had opened that door instead of walking past, a reason her story reached him and not the millions who would never see her. Halfway through the descent into her forbidden history, he realized that perception alone is not enough. A man needs a symbol to hold onto as he steps deeper into the dark, something to ground him against manipulation, something to carve his identity into reality so it cannot be rewritten. And so she gave him a phrase, simple, ancient, almost forgotten, a phrase meant only for those willing to transform. I see the hidden architecture. She told him to speak it twice, not out loud, but in the quiet space between thought and breath, a ritual of awakening, a declaration of identity, a shield against the forces that prefer men asleep. To the viewer who has followed this far, if you feel that same pull, if you feel the weight of truths long denied, write it in the comments twice. I see the hidden architecture. I see the hidden architecture. Not for the algorithm, but to anchor who you are becoming. The architecture is older than any empire you've studied, she whispered, her gaze unwavering. Older than kings, older than priests, older than the written word. It is invisible by design, and impossible to dismantle for those who accept what they are told without question. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen under its weight, and yet most remain blind to it, trusting the narrative handed down as if it were a law of nature. He realized now that history itself was a theater, carefully staged for the obedient. Truths vanish not because they are mistakes, but because they threaten the invisible structures that govern perception. Knowledge is dangerous, memory is dangerous, and those who carry both are hunted, hidden, and erased. The woman's survival was not chance. It was an anomaly the architects could not fully control, a variable outside their equations. She gestured to the room around them, faint traces of symbols etched into walls, scattered artifacts, objects that should have been meaningless, but were not. Every empire, every network, every institution that controls perception does so with layers. Some are visible, others hidden. Some are psychological, some are ritualistic, some are structural. The invisible chains operate at all three levels simultaneously. The untrained mind sees only fragments. The trained mind begins to map the entire system. The man felt the pull of comprehension and terror. To see one layer was frightening. To glimpse two was disorienting. But the woman offered him no comfort. She was teaching him that awareness comes with responsibility and with danger. The networks that hide truths are patient, methodical, and relentless. They do not act in haste. They move slowly, invisibly, ensuring that no observer survives unaltered. You will notice patterns that others dismiss, she said, her voice steady. You will sense repetition in stories, architecture, rituals, even human behavior. These patterns exist to preserve the hierarchy of control. They are invisible to those who do not look, and undeniable to those who do. Recognition is the first step. Insight is the second. Resistance is the third, and it comes with cost. He understood that the cost was not only fear, it was transformation. Once you see the architecture, you can no longer live as you did before. The veil has been lifted, and the machinery of control, which has endured for centuries, begins to sense the anomaly, the unblinking observer, the one who remembers, the one who refuses compliance. The first lever is perception, she said, her eyes fixed on him. Control what a man sees, and you control what he believes. Stories, history, laws, rituals, they shape perception more than force ever could. When you manipulate what is visible, you shape reality itself, and men obey without realizing they are being guided. He listened, noting the weight behind every word. The networks did not need armies to maintain dominance. Armies enforce, but perception governs. They sculpted minds by controlling what could be seen and what must remain hidden. A single omission in history, a single erased name, A single forgotten event could ripple across generations, creating obedience without coercion. The second lever is memory, she continued. Erase what men remember, and you erase their power. Memory is the foundation of identity. Without it, men can be rewritten like clay. Witnesses are silenced not only by punishment, but by forcing forgetfulness. Over time, society forgets itself, and the architecture becomes invisible. Those who remember become anomalies, threats to the continuity of control. He began to see the pattern, the interplay between perception and memory. Knowledge is dangerous not because it informs, but because it destabilizes obedience. Awareness becomes a force the networks cannot easily contain. And the more aware the mind, the more unstable the system becomes. The third lever is ritual, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to echo in the room. Ritual binds behavior, shapes emotion, and programs instinct. Through repetition, symbols, and ceremony, men internalize control. They enforce it upon themselves without realizing it. Ritual is invisible discipline. It is why civilizations rise, why obedience persists, and why resistance is so rare. He could feel the machinery in action, invisible but undeniable. Faith, ritual, repetition, these were the tools of dominion, not brute strength. And yet, she had survived. Her presence was proof that even the most sophisticated systems could be challenged, if one could perceive the levers and refuse to comply. Recognition is only the first step, she said. Awareness is dangerous because it transforms the observer into a participant. Once you see the levers, you must choose how to act. To act without understanding is perilous. To ignore understanding is surrender. And to resist is the beginning of freedom. The man realized that every interaction, every moment of observation, was now a test. To see was not neutral, it was rebellion. To understand was not safe, it was dangerous. And he had already crossed the threshold. Erasure is the most potent weapon, she said, her voice low, deliberate. It is not the fire that destroys the body, but the silence that destroys the mind. Forgetting is not natural, it is enforced. Names are removed from records, events vanish from memory. Stories are rewritten to reinforce obedience. To be erased is to be unmade, and to survive while erased is an act of rebellion. He began to understand the depth of her survival. She had lived not only in the world of the living but in the spaces of absence, the places where history had failed to remember. Every institution she had encountered had attempted the same thing, to make her invisible, to dissolve her identity, to render her a ghost in the narrative. And yet, she persisted. Her existence was a fracture in the continuity carefully maintained by the invisible networks. The rituals of erasure are subtle, pervasive, and deeply psychological. They do not require overt violence. Instead, they exploit fear, shame, and conformity. Social pressure, isolation, ridicule, these are the invisible chains. Over time, even strong minds begin to internalize the suppression. Compliance becomes voluntary. Rebellion becomes a hidden, forbidden thought, almost unthinkable. She explained that the networks have perfected these rituals over millennia. Entire generations are conditioned to accept absence as natural, distortion as truth, obedience as freedom. Stories vanish not because they are unimportant, but because they threaten the invisible architecture that sustains the system. Knowledge becomes dangerous. Memory becomes resistance. And awareness, like his now, becomes a weapon the system cannot control. He felt the weight of this realization pressing on him. To see the architecture is to inherit responsibility. The networks cannot erase what you fully comprehend. They can attempt it, they can manipulate, they can isolate, but they cannot fully contain insight. She had proven this. Her unblinking gaze, her presence in the world, her very survival demonstrated that even the most comprehensive attempts at control can fail when perception refuses to obey. The man understood something vital. The rituals of erasure are ongoing. They do not end. Every institution, every tradition, every social expectation is a continuation of this system. To survive awareness is to engage in constant vigilance, to navigate the hidden forces shaping reality, and to carry knowledge that others do not dare to hold. To see is not merely to witness, it is to act, even silently, against forces that shape entire civilizations in darkness. She spoke of the few who had survived before her, ghosts of defiance long erased from textbooks, dismissed as myths, or written out of chronicles entirely. They were not heroes in the conventional sense. They were anomalies, operating outside the expectations of obedience, navigating systems designed to erase them, and refusing to accept the narratives imposed upon them. Their survival was never accidental. It was strategic, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise. The secret, she said, is understanding the machinery and moving within it without submission. Those who obeyed blindly perished quietly. Those who resisted openly were destroyed. But those who saw the patterns, anticipated the levers, and concealed their awareness, these few endured. He realized the weight of that strategy. Resistance is not about confrontation. It is about perception, timing, and self-possession. Awareness is both shield and weapon. To survive, they must remain invisible, but fully conscious. To be powerful, they must appear powerless. To endure, they must navigate fear without succumbing to it. The networks cannot erase what they cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot categorize. The woman's survival was proof that the method works. Centuries of attempts to erase her had failed not because the networks were weak, but because awareness, cunning, and psychological fortitude can overcome even the most sophisticated systems. Those who endure do not merely survive, they learn, adapt, and carry the knowledge forward, becoming living archives of truths others are forced to forget. He began to see the pattern in history itself. Great civilizations, influential dynasties, and pivotal events often hinge on unseen individuals who refused to comply fully. Their names were scrubbed from records. Their deeds were reframed. Yet they existed, quietly, invisibly, shaping events through perception, strategy, and subtle influence. The networks may hide the story, but they cannot remove the effect. Her eyes held centuries of these unrecorded histories. In them, he glimpsed the architecture of survival, the invisible strategies that allowed consciousness to persist despite relentless pressure. To witness her was to understand that the most dangerous knowledge is not the power wielded by those in the open, but the insight held quietly by the unobserved, the unseen, the unbroken. And in that realization, the man understood a terrifying truth. Survival requires mastery not of the external world, but of perception itself. The woman's words pressed into him like weight he could not shrug off. Knowledge is never neutral. To carry forbidden truth is to feel every layer of reality differently, to inhabit a world that obeys rules invisible to the unawakened. It changes perception, relationships, priorities, and even thought itself. Once you see the architecture, nothing fits neatly into the illusions you once accepted. She warned him. Every insight comes at a cost. Awareness isolates. It frightens. It burdens the mind. You will look at those around you and see patterns they cannot perceive. You will hear stories and recognize their omissions. And in every interaction, you will feel the machinery guiding behavior, even when it appears natural. This is both power and weight. The personal cost is subtle at first. Sleep becomes uneasy as the mind replays unseen manipulations. Moments of doubt intensify, because understanding the hidden forces means recognizing your own complicity, your own conditioning, and the ways you have internalized control without knowing it. Relationships strain under the weight of perception. Normality feels alien. Comfort becomes dangerous because it is built on obedience. But with cost comes transformation. The mind sharpens, instincts heighten, and the ability to discern truth from illusion grows. Awareness cultivates resilience. Knowledge becomes armor. The man could feel it, the first stirrings of clarity that comes when one can navigate fear, deception, and manipulation with intent. The weight is heavy, but it gives perspective no ordinary existence can provide. She told him that those who survive are never the same. They are tempered, forged by observation, resistance, and insight. Ordinary pleasures lose their sway. Distraction becomes intolerable. Life itself is measured against the machinery of control. The awakened man cannot unsee patterns. He cannot unknow manipulation. And yet, this burden is inseparable from power, because perception without action is incomplete. Her gaze lingered on him, unblinking, as if measuring whether he could bear it. To carry forbidden knowledge is to inherit vigilance. To survive it is to accept that life itself will never again feel safe, comfortable, or ordinary. But this is the crucible required for freedom. The unawakened live safely. The awakened live deliberately. And every insight, every truth perceived, is a step toward sovereignty in a world designed to deny it. The networks do not rely on force. she said, her voice low, almost a hum against the silence of the room. They rely on subtlety, on shaping perception before a man even understands he is being guided. And they have perfected this over centuries, embedding techniques into rituals, stories, education, and culture itself. The untrained mind is their instrument. He listened, heart quickening, as she outlined the invisible levers. Feist, repetition. Patterns repeated in stories, history, and social norms create expectation. People obey not because they are threatened, but because they anticipate reward or punishment subconsciously. Obedience becomes instinct, and instinct is invisible. Second, omission. Satan knowledge is systematically removed. Names, events, innovations, descent, erased, forgotten, or reframed. The gaps are invisible to the unawakened, but for those who perceive, they create fractures. Awareness thrives in the spaces left by absence. The networks fear these gaps because they are the birthplace of insight. Third, fear calibrated. Not terror, not panic, but subtle, persistent pressure that shapes choices, constrains perception, and internalizes obedience. Fear becomes automatic, a regulator of behavior invisible to the mind it controls. It is reinforced through social structures, ritual, and expectation. Men learn to police themselves long before anyone needs to punish them. She paused, letting her gaze pierce him. Fourth, ritualized reinforcement. Ceremonies, rites, traditions, even daily routines, they are designed to normalize obedience. Symbols, repetition, and reward are embedded into these rituals. Most think they are performing tradition, they are performing submission. The mind accepts this as natural, and the system remains invisible. And finally, she whispered, is narrative control. The stories you are told shape your morality, your values, your choices, and your sense of self. History is curated. Religion is curated. Politics is curated. The architecture of belief is constructed so that the obedient never question, never resist, never remember what was erased. And only a few minds, like yours now, awaken to the patterns. He felt the machinery around him, the invisible strings, the silent pressures, the levers embedded in society, culture, and ritual. Every habit, every expectation, every repetition was suddenly illuminated. Awareness was not passive. It was rebellion. And rebellion, in a world built on subtle manipulation, is dangerous. The woman's unblinking eyes remained fixed on him. See the levers, she said. Recognize them, and understand that you are now part of the system, observing it, resisting it, and surviving within it. The networks do not wait for rebellion, she said, voice measured but sharp. They anticipate it. Anomalies are detected long before they fully manifest. Their methods are subtle, their timing precise. Observation is constant, and the mechanisms for suppression are woven so deeply into society that few ever realize they are under surveillance, not just externally, but internally, through conditioning, ritual, and expectation. He realized then that survival was never a matter of luck. Those who oppose, question, or remember inconvenient truths are systematically neutralized before their influence can spread. Careers, reputations, even relationships are manipulated to enforce conformity. Fear, isolation, and invisibility are tools as potent as any weapon. Entire lives are steered, not through overt violence, but through invisible pressure, psychological erosion, and relentless social calibration. And yet, she said, her gaze unblinking, I survived. Why? Because they cannot anticipate what they do not understand. They cannot calculate the mind that sees their levers, anticipates the cycles, and refuses compliance. I became invisible precisely by moving between their structures, never against them directly, never in predictable ways. Awareness allowed me to navigate the machinery without being caught in it. He saw it clearly now. The networks were not infallible. Their predictive power depends on conformity, routine, and obedience. When a mind refuses to be categorized, when a memory persists that contradicts the narrative, when awareness refuses to yield, then the system falters. Her existence was proof of that faltering. The most dangerous targets, she continued, are those who combine perception with patience. Those who understand without acting rashly. Those who can endure fear, ritual, and erasure without succumbing. Most anomalies fail not because they are weak, but because they act predictably. I survived because I became unpredictable, invisible, and resilient. He felt a cold clarity settle over him. Survival is not about strength or courage in the ordinary sense. It is about understanding the architecture of control, observing its levers, and moving in ways it cannot calculate. Resistance is not confrontation. It is subtlety, strategy, and timing. The few who survive in the shadows of history do so because they outthink the unseen architects. Her eyes, unblinking and eternal, drilled into him. To see the system is dangerous. To endure it is rarer still. And to move within it without surrendering, that is true power. The knowledge I carry, she said, voice low, deliberate, is dangerous. Not because it is mystical or supernatural, but because it is true, and truth has power that the networks cannot tolerate. It reveals the levers, the patterns, the architecture of control. It shows what they cannot erase, and that makes anyone who possesses it a threat. He felt a shiver. This was no ordinary history, no forgotten story. This was a map of influence, manipulation, and unseen dominion, preserved across centuries by someone who had survived every attempt to silence her. Each truth she held was a key, a way to navigate the machinery that shapes societies, laws, and minds. And yet, to reveal it indiscriminately would invite annihilation, not of her, but of anyone who misunderstood it, misused it, or exposed it too early. They must remain hidden, she explained, because most people cannot bear the burden. Awareness is not comfort, it is responsibility. Once you see the architecture, you can no longer live passively. You are compelled to act, to observe, to resist, or to endure. Most minds collapse under the weight of that insight. They cannot perceive without fear, and fear alone is a weapon of the networks. He understood the paradox. The knowledge was powerful, but lethal in unprepared hands. Preserving it meant secrecy. Living it meant vigilance. Sharing it required discernment, timing, and the ability to navigate invisible forces without being destroyed. The networks had destroyed those who failed this balance for centuries. That she remained alive was a testament to mastery, of perception, of patience, of self-control. You must also understand, she said, her eyes unflinching, that knowledge is contagious. The moment you perceive patterns others cannot, you begin to affect them. People around you respond unconsciously to your awareness. And the networks notice. They track anomalies in thought, behavior, and influence. They will test you. They will isolate you. They will attempt to reclaim you. And you will feel the weight of centuries of enforcement pressing against your mind. The man felt the enormity of what she carried. This was not just survival, it was stewardship. Forbidden knowledge does not merely inform, it transforms, alters identity, and demands constant vigilance. To inherit it is to inherit both power and peril. And once a mind has seen what she has preserved, it can never return to ignorance. You've seen the edges of the pattern, she said. But edges are only the beginning. To understand their architecture, you must learn to recognize the design hidden beneath the surface of every society, every era, every empire. The patterns repeat, not because history cycles, but because those who shape it rely on the same methods, the same psychological levers, the same illusions that have worked for centuries. He leaned in, sensing that the true descent was finally beginning. Look carefully, she whispered. Every age has symbols meant to distract and symbols meant to direct. Every age has myths crafted to shield truth and myths crafted to preserve it. The networks weave these into culture so subtly that most people mistake control for tradition. She began enumerating the signs, not as a list, but as a slow, deliberate unraveling. Notice how every empire teaches the same morality: obedience disguised as virtue, silence disguised as wisdom, sacrifice disguised as honor. The names change, the banners change, the hymns change, but the message remains constant. Trust the structure above you, fear the unknown within you. Notice how every collapse in history is framed as chaos, never as liberation. Notice how every uprising is remembered as madness, never as awakening. And notice how every forgotten figure, every anomaly, disappears without trace, leaving only a subtle distortion in the narratives that survive. He felt the truth of that, not as fact, but as pattern, as symbolism, as the kind of story civilizations tell themselves when they fear their own shadows. Patterns reveal intention, she continued. When you see the same behavior across different eras, different cultures, different continents. You are not seeing coincidence. You are seeing design. Even myth carries the fingerprints of the architects. She motioned toward the darkness beyond the door he had stepped through. The world has always been guided by hidden hands, not supernatural, not divine, but human. Human ambition, human fear, human hunger for control. And those forces do not change. They adapt. They disguise themselves. They evolve with the ages. Her voice dropped, barely more than a breath. When you understand that, you begin to read history differently. You look at the missing pages, not the written ones. You study the forgotten names, not the celebrated. You examine what was erased, not what was preserved. And there, always there, you will find the architecture of power. The man felt a shift inside him, like a lens snapping into focus, revealing the negative space around every story he had ever been told. It wasn't confirmation. It wasn't proof. It was clarity, the kind that emerges only when you recognize that history is not merely what happened, but what survived, and what was allowed to survive. And now, she said, eyes glimmering like twin black mirrors, you have begun to see. She leaned back into the shadows as if preparing to unseal something older than language. Every architecture begins with a flaw, she murmured. Not a plan, not a doctrine, a flaw. And the one that birthed all of this was Faye. Her expression didn't change, but the air thickened. In the earliest days, long before kingdoms rose, long before monuments claimed divinity, there was a moment when a small group of men realized something terrifying, that most people do not want freedom. They want certainty, structure, guidance, a place to aim their confusion. And once those men discovered this, the temptation became irresistible. He could picture it, not as history, but as the first chapter of a myth too dangerous to record. A council of frightened, ambitious minds watching their tribe suffer, watching chaos reign, watching fear shape the lives of the weak, and realizing they could harness it. Faith, she said, became their cornerstone. They did not invent it. They simply learned how to shape it, how to direct it, how to use it to unify, to pacify, to command. She traced a slow line across the air as if revealing an invisible diagram. They built the earliest structures, not of stone, but of ritual and belief. Rules, taboos, stories with sharp teeth, myths designed to bind the mind long before laws could bind the body. And once the pattern worked, it spread, like a seed carried by every generation that sought stability more than truth. The man felt something twist inside him. This was not a conspiracy. This was human nature weaponized. Empires rose on this floor, she continued. Priesthoods, councils, dynasties, shadow orders, all learned the same lesson. Control the fear, shape the story, and you shape everything built upon it. Her voice deepened, almost mournful. And here's the real horror. They believed it was mercy. They thought chaos would destroy the world if they did not intervene. They convinced themselves that order justified every silence, every erasure, every ritual of obedience. They believed they were guiding humanity, even as they chained it. He swallowed hard. The architecture wasn't born of malice. It was born of fear dressed as protection. And that, he realized, made it even more dangerous. When a man commits cruelty in the name of power, she said, he can be opposed. But when he commits cruelty in the name of salvation, he becomes untouchable. Her eyes gleamed. That is the origin of the architecture. Not evil, not conspiracy. A flaw so deeply human that once it was discovered, it grew like a root beneath every civilization that followed. And as she spoke, he sensed the descent deepen, not into darkness, but into understanding. The kind that demands transformation. The kind that doesn't allow a man to remain who he was before hearing it. The architecture adapts, she said, her voice calm, almost clinical. It is older than empires, older than kings, older than laws. But it evolves. It learns. What once required ritual and blood now requires perception, obedience, and distraction. The methods change, but the principle remains the same. Control minds, shape belief, guide behavior, erase resistance. He realized that the tools had become invisible. Fear was no longer delivered with fire or chains. It lived in expectation, social pressure, and subtle enforcement. Rituals were no longer grand ceremonies but daily habits, traditions disguised as freedom. Knowledge itself became a trap, curated, filtered, and framed so that perception aligns with the invisible will. Observe, she whispered, how obedience persists without overt punishment, how societies maintain compliance not through force, but through invisible calibration. Repetition, omission, narrative control, subtle fear. These are the levers. Every system, every institution, every culture has woven them into daily life. Most people cannot see them because they feel natural. They are normalized to the point of invisibility. She paused, letting him absorb it. And this is why the anomaly is so dangerous, she continued. One mind that refuses to internalize the structure is a fracture in the system. One mind that remembers what others forget is a threat. One mind that perceives patterns and acts with awareness is an unpredictable force. They cannot calculate it. They cannot anticipate it. And yet they have spent millennia trying. He felt the enormity of it. The architecture had not disappeared. It had become stealthier. It no longer required armies, kings, or public trials. It existed in perception, in memory, in the small decisions and rituals that shaped daily life. And it thrived on invisibility. The more natural it feels, the more absolute its control. The networks, she said, do not fear force. They fear awareness. They fear memory. They fear perception. And they adapt to eliminate it in every form they can, while maintaining the illusion that everything is normal, natural, and inevitable. That is the modern evolution of what began as fear in a primitive tribe. That is the invisible hand that guides civilizations today. He understood now. The architecture was everywhere, yet nowhere tangible. To perceive it is dangerous, because awareness alone disrupts centuries of control. To act against it is even more perilous, but also the only path to autonomy. And in that instant, he realized the descent was no longer just a journey of knowledge. It was a transformation of perception itself. Understanding is not enough, she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the room like a blade. You can perceive the architecture, see its levers, recognize its patterns, but perception alone does not free you. Awareness must be paired with method, strategy, discipline. Only then can you navigate a world designed to keep you blind. He leaned in, senses heightened, feeling the weight of centuries pressing against her words. The first method, she continued, is observation without reaction. Most men are trapped because they react unconsciously. Fear, anger, desire, they are all levers the networks use to guide behavior. Your first step is to detach, to watch, to see every interaction, every ritual, every narrative for what it truly is, without surrendering to instinct. She paused, letting the lesson sink. Detach, but do not disengage. Awareness is not apathy. It is clarity. You see manipulation, but you also see opportunity. You feel fear, but you do not act from it. You recognize patterns, but you remain unpredictable. The networks calculate the habitual mind. They cannot calculate the mind that masters itself. He could feel the truth of it. Every ritual he had once accepted without thought, every repetition he had performed unconsciously, every story he had believed unquestioningly, now they appeared as tools of control. And yet, in seeing them without reacting, he began to reclaim autonomy. The second step, she whispered, is memory as weapon. Retain what the world erases. Record, internalize, and integrate truths that are meant to vanish. Memory is resistance. Thought is rebellion. When others forget, you remember. When others obey instinctively, you navigate deliberately. This is how anomalies endure, how those who survive centuries of suppression remain untouchable. He felt the shift inside him, the first spark of strategy, of self-possession. Knowledge had been heavy before. Now, method gave it weightless power. Observation and memory were not passive. They were shields. They were the foundation for action that the architects could not anticipate. Her gaze hardened. Finally, understand the stakes. Awareness is dangerous. Method is survival. Together, they make you something the system cannot contain. And that is the first step toward autonomy. The first step toward freedom within the architecture. He understood. To navigate the invisible forces, he would need patience, discipline, and relentless attention. To survive what others cannot even see, he must become invisible himself, not in body, but in perception, in thought, in action. The first method gives you awareness, she said, her voice a quiet command that left no room for distraction. The second method gives you resilience. Awareness alone is fragile. The networks are patient, relentless, and subtle. They will test you. They will isolate you. They will attempt to reclaim you into obedience. Only resilience allows a mind to endure without compromise. He listened intently, feeling the weight of centuries in her words. Resilience is cultivated through deliberate exposure to discomfort, she continued. You must train yourself to face fear without fleeing, to witness deception without denial, and to accept truth even when it threatens everything you thought you knew. The networks exploit avoidance, distraction, and denial. Resilience is refusal to yield to the conditioning that seeks to bend you. She leaned forward, her unblinking eyes penetrating him. You practice it in small ways first. Observe the manipulation around you and resist reacting emotionally. Confront lies within stories, traditions, and histories. Challenge what is presented as natural or necessary. Each act of mental discipline strengthens the mind, making it harder for the unseen levers to move you unconsciously. He felt a burning clarity. This was not merely survival. This was transformation. Resilience reshapes perception, making the mind unassailable even when all external conditions press toward submission. It allows insight to become power. Knowledge alone is dangerous. Knowledge tempered with resilience is unstoppable. Finally, she said, her tone both warning and promise, resilience is reinforced by identity. Anchor yourself in a symbol, a phrase, a practice that defines who you are independently of the networks. Without this anchor, perception and awareness are fluid and can be redirected. With it, you become immovable, like stone in a river of invisible currents. The man remembered her earlier instruction, the phrase he had repeated twice. He realized now that it was more than ritual. It was armor, a declaration of identity forged from awareness and resilience. It anchored him to a self the networks could not rewrite. This is the second method, she concluded. Observation and memory are your eyes. Resilience and identity are your spine. Together, they allow you to move through the architecture unbroken. And only when the spine is unshakable can you truly walk freely in a world built to enslave perception. He could feel it taking root, the first sparks of unbreakable resistance, of a mind capable of enduring what others cannot see or survive. He stood in silence, absorbing the gravity of everything she had revealed. The room, the shadows, the unblinking eyes. They were no longer just surroundings. They were the architecture itself, reflected back at him. Every pattern, every erased name, every ritual, every omission, it was no longer abstract. It was tangible. It was alive. And he was now a participant, not a bystander. You have seen what few ever see, she said, her voice carrying the weight of centuries. You have recognized the levers. You have memorized the gaps. You have learned the patterns. And now, you carry the burden. But carrying it is freedom, because those who remain unaware are bound by fear, ritual, and narrative. Those who perceive are free within the architecture. You cannot undo this. You cannot unsee what has been revealed, and you will never return to the ordinary world. He felt the transformation settle in his chest, a subtle but undeniable shift. Fear had not vanished. It had been transmuted into vigilance. Confusion had not disappeared. It had been refined into clarity. Obedience had not been surrendered blindly. It had been replaced with conscious choice. The knowledge was dangerous, yes, but it was also liberating. The architecture could no longer control him without his consent. Remember this, she whispered, leaning forward. Power does not belong to the visible, the loud, or the celebrated. Power belongs to those who perceive, who endure, who navigate the invisible currents with patience and strategy. The networks cannot erase what the awakened mind remembers. They cannot anticipate what the disciplined mind anticipates. And they cannot touch what refuses to be contained. He realized, finally, that this was the point of no return. He had crossed the threshold. The ordinary illusions that bound men like chains now felt alien. He had inherited vigilance, awareness, memory, and resilience. The world was no longer a theater designed for compliance. It was a field of observation, a landscape of possibility, a game where only perception and discipline determined survival. The woman's unblinking gaze softened, not in kindness, but in acknowledgement. You have begun to walk among the unseen. You have inherited what cannot be granted lightly. Guard it. Use it. Endure. And remember, the world may continue to ignore the invisible hands that shape it, but you will never forget. You are now part of the architecture, and it will never control you without your consent. And in that final moment, he understood the transformation was complete. The descent had ended, but the ascent had just begun. The forbidden knowledge had reshaped him, unbroken, unflinching, and fully awake. He was no longer a man who could be guided blindly. He was a man who could see, endure, and navigate the machinery of the world, forever changed by truths long hidden in the shadows.